Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. The atheist political commentator Bill Maher, host of the popular HBO show Real Time with Bill Maher, has long been a bitter critic of Christianity. In addition to regular swipes at Christians on his television shows over the years, Maher also devoted an entire documentary film sardonically entitled Religulous to lampoon what he takes to be Christianity's moral and theological absurdities. However, Maher has recently tempered his anti-Christian rhetoric and started focusing his biting wit on criticizing progressive woke ideology, condemning positions like neo-racism, the denial of biology, the stifling of free speech, and the division of the world into simplistic oppressors versus oppressed categories in ways that the Catholic tradition would largely agree with. In light of this apparent shift, is it time for people of faith to reassess Bill Maher? Has one of Christianity's most vocal opponents now become an ally or perhaps even a friend? Or is Maher's apparent détente with Christianity only temporary? Here to help us think through these and related questions is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, welcome back to the studio. You recently wrote an article on the atheist political commentator Bill Maher's apparent shift away from his usual vitriolic anti-Christian rhetoric, that's the foundation for today's show. But before we get into that, what have you been up to recently?
A lot of things, but one was ordination of 3 young guys to the diaconate. So 3 of our guys for the Winona, Rochester Diocese. I had the great privilege of ordaining down in our cathedral in Winona. I've often said, as a bishop, the greatest privilege I have is ordaining people to diaconate and priesthood. So these 3 guys, all good candidates for the priesthood next year, and this will be a great gift to our diocese. So that was a real joy last Saturday.
How frequently do those ordinations take place?
Well, my first year here, we didn't have anyone to be ordained. I ordained 3 deacons last year. I'll be ordaining them as priests in just about a week from the time we're recording this. So the next several years, I'll be ordaining people for our diocese to the priesthood.
All right. So back to your recent article on Bill Maher. In that article, you invite people of faith to appreciate, or at least to note, that Bill Maher does seem to have shifted away from his historic sort of acerbic disdain for Christianity. And we're going to get into that and his move towards some moral and political positions that appear to be at least basically consonant with the Catholic social thought tradition. But before we do, I think it's worth looking at sort of historically some of the things he said about religion. And you've written about this in the past. So I'd like to read you a quote from his 2008 movie, Religulous, and then get you to react to it. So this is towards the end of the movie. He says, "The irony of religion is that because of its power to divert man to destructive courses, the world could actually come to an end. The plain fact is, religion must die for mankind to live." He continues, "The hour is getting very late to be able to indulge in having key decisions made by religious people, by irrationalists, by those who would steer the ship of the state, not by a compass, but by the equivalent of reading the entrails of a chicken." He concludes here, "Faith means making a virtue out of not thinking."
Yeah, I mean, that's colossally stupid. And I don't imply for a second, Matt, though, that he's somehow repudiated all that. I think he's turned away from a preoccupation with religion to looking at the more woke issues. And that's what I find more appealing. I don't think he's changed his mind on religion. He said that over and over again. But that's a good example of the level of analysis he was at, which is a very low level. So no, I don't think he's changed his mind on religion, and I've not changed my mind in regard to my assessment of him on religion. I'm just happy he's kind of spending a lot less time preoccupied with I would say, crude forms of fundamentalist religion. That's what he's been focused on. He's turned from that to wokeism. And I find myself often agreeing with him on the wokeist business, even as I continue to disagree with him dramatically on religion.
We'll get into some areas of possible consensus in a moment. But for those who perhaps are just learning about Bill Maher for the first time, there's still a reservoir of people for whom those kinds of arguments that he's making still have some bite.
Right.
So you actually wrote an article some years ago that says, so Bill Maher, the title is Bill Maher and Not Understanding Either the Faith or the Bible. So before we move on, I'd just like to rehash briefly your key arguments against Maher's position of religion, because again, some people still do hold those views. So you write, for example, what Maher characterizes as faith is nothing but superstition or credulity or intellectual irresponsibility. Say more about what you mean there and why Maher's getting it wrong.
Yeah, and that's a typical move by a rationalist to say, well, faith, it's not reason, therefore it must be sub-rational. So when I say superstition or credulity, I mean that what's below reason. The church has never been in favor of what's below reason. We always want to raise people to the level of reason. We're not at all at home with superstition or credulity. Authentic faith stands beyond reason. It's on the far side of reason. It's a kind of trust beyond what reason can see. So therefore, it's not at all opposed to reason. So what happens is when you construe faith incorrectly, you set up this false dichotomy. Either you're a man of reason or you're a man of faith. No, of course, you can be both, as our great figures from Jerome and Chrysostom and Augustine and Aquinas and so on have all been people of both faith and reason. So that's the problem he falls into there, is he first misconstrues faith as infra-rational rather than supra-rational, and thereby falls into this false dichotomy. And as you say correctly, that's entertained by an awful lot of people.
In this previous article you wrote as well, you argue that Maher doesn't get that not all the words of Scripture are meant to be interpreted literally. Mm-hmm. You write with a nod to the Vatican II document De Verbum, the Bible is the Word of God in the words of men. Say more about why that interpretive principle is so important.
It's a very important principle, and it's an ancient principle too. Don't believe those critics of religion who say, well, it's only because, we scientists pushed you religious people. No. From the earliest century of the church, we recognized the subtle interpretive strategies that have to be employed when looking at the Bible. So the famous four senses, for example, in the Church Fathers. Augustine gives us, in the 4th century, richly non-literalistic readings of key texts in the Bible. So there's nothing new about that. We've always recognized the difference of genre, for example, that you're looking at the Bible. And this I said in one of my earliest videos, Answering Religulous, Maher's movie, where I said, look, the Bible is not a book. It's a collection of books. It's more like a library. And so to ask the question, do you take the Bible literally, is like saying, do you take the library literally? It depends on what section of the library you're in. The same is true of the biblical books. Some should be read in a more or less straightforward way, but others are more poetic. There are apocalyptic texts. There's wisdom literature. There's gospel, which is its own distinctive genre, more like ancient biography. You've got epistolary literature, like the Pauline letters. You've got legendary elements and so on. So it depends on what part of the Bible you're in. A mistake that people like Maher tend to make is they want to be univocal about it. There's one way to read the Bible, literalistically. Therefore, if you've got a story like Jonah, well, it's obviously ridiculous, the whole Bible's crazy, and let's move on. Instead of doing, I'll give him full credit, Jordan Peterson, who wasn't trained in this. He more or less stumbled upon it, but stumbled upon these different interpretive strategies for approaching these books. Watch, for example, Maher's conversation with Peterson on the book of Jonah, where Maher's like, well, it's a silly children's story that's so ridiculous. And then Peterson patiently unpacking at least a few more dimensions of meaning of that story. We need those subtle, sophisticated strategies of interpretation.
A related interpretive principle, but also importantly distinct, is you quote William Platcher's claim that we must make a distinction between what's in the Bible versus what the Bible actually teaches.
Yeah, I read that years ago in his text, and I thought it was a very illuminating remark. There are a lot of things that are in the Bible. So you open it up and you read it and you say, oh, there it is in the Bible. But are they more or less along for the ride culturally, that they're part of the intellectual baggage of a certain time? Or are they really what the Bible is authentically trying to teach us? To get at that latter principle, I think you have to look at what I'd call patterns, themes, and trajectories within the Bible. Simply to open it up and say, oh, there it is in the Bible. Well, what are you pointing to? Something kind of along for the ride culturally, or something that belongs to the central teaching trajectory of the Bible? Now, I'd speak as a Catholic here. That's why you need the church.
Right.
You need an interpretive tradition that goes all the way back, disciplined finally by the authority of the church to say, this is what the Bible's teaching. When you get rid of that, you jettison that, and now everyone becomes his own pope, essentially, we have this problem. Then everyone interprets it according to his own lights. The Catholic Church has always recognized the central importance of an interpretive referee, if you want.
Let's now move into, so that's what Bill Maher is getting wrong, and probably still getting wrong. We haven't seen any evidence of a shift yet. But let's now turn into his potential political shift in the values that he's affirming. So in this recent article that you wrote, you identify a number of positions in the radically progressive wokist ideology.
Yeah.
Let me list some of them that Maher is rejecting, and you think that he's right to reject, and we'll see why the consensus is there at a deeper level. So the first is a strict limitation on the freedom of speech and a desire to cancel opposing views. And Maher is completely against that, and you say,
hooray for him,
right.
Yeah. Yeah, this, I don't know, man, it was a couple years ago, I'd watch his show real time. It would come on, cable. I'd stumble across it. And he always had interesting people on, and, he's funny. And so I would watch it. When he was preoccupied with religion, I found him, off-putting. But as I kept watching him and he was critiquing this woke business, I found myself saying, yeah, right. And a surprising amount of the time, I found myself agreeing with him. And that's a good example. He's an advocate of freedom of speech, hates the cancel culture, which is essential to wokeism. If I disagree with you, I have to destroy your life, not just make a case against you using rational means in the public forum. I have to destroy your life. That's deeply illiberal. So here, liberalism as a positive set of values, that's a deeply illiberal position to take. And it is sadly typical of wokeism. So there I very much agree with him.
Another issue that, within progressive wokist politics that he strongly condemns is what you describe as a re-racialization of consciousness.
Absolutely. I'm a Martin Luther King man. He's one of my heroes. And King, who dreamed of a colorblind society where my children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Amen. I still think that's a great ideal. The trouble with so much of the wokist rhetoric and literature is they explicitly go against that. They'll explicitly say that Martin Luther King's ideal is not an ideal. Mm-hmm. We don't want a colorblind society. In fact, we become hypersensitive in a way that's even redolent of pre-civil rights America, hypersensitive to even the subtlest demarcations along racial lines. I'm with King. I think we should stop judging people in any way by the color of their skin and focus on the content of their character. I'm for a meritocracy as King was. So I think the colorblind society is still an ideal, and I think Bill Maher does too. And that's why we're both uneasy with this, indeed, re-racialization of our consciousness. We're extremely conscious of racial differences. Let's move beyond that. Let's follow King's dream, which was, I think, also ultimately the dream of the great liberal political tradition.
Some have categorized the progressive conception of race as a form of neo-racism. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah. My principle, I agree. I think it was one of the Supreme Court justices recently said, if you want to end racial discrimination, stop discriminating on the basis of race. So this idea that we can correct past injustice by present injustice, I mean, that violates the Catholic principle. You can't do evil that good might come of it.
Right.
So I've been opposed to that too from the beginning. So is Bill Maher.
Another policy, idea and policy that he rejects, and you note that he does positively, is forced equality of outcome.
Right.
Now, say a little bit more, because some may hear of the Catholic social thought tradition, know how important social justice is to the Catholic social thought tradition, say, well, wait a minute, isn't that what the Catholic position is?
No, because you're right in using that phrase, social justice, and our justice tradition. Equality of opportunity is the justice called for, I think, appropriately by a liberal society and by Catholic social teaching, that everybody should have a fair shake. Everyone has an equality of opportunity to enter into the marketplace of ideas, to enter into civil society. When you say, no, the goal is equity of outcome, so there should be an absolute equity when it comes to, let's say, the racial divisions within a society, and I'm going to impose that through certain legal means and social pressure. No, now you're inviting, in fact, a deep injustice to obtain. You're no longer dealing with a meritocracy, but you're trying to fit society into a kind of preconceived conception of what's equal. It's equality of opportunity. And again, I think Bill Maher agrees with that. The word equality is thrown around a lot, and I like to keep insisting on that distinction. And I like even keeping equality of opportunity, equity of outcome, so we keep those distinct. Mm-hmm. We want the former, not the latter. The latter, in fact, is an invitation to a kind of totalitarianism, right, where the society is going to be imposing itself dramatically on the whole of life. No, equality of opportunity, that's basic justice. And I'm for that. Bill Maher's for that. And I think the classic liberal tradition is for that.
To get a little more precision on the distinction here, whether we're calling it equity of outcome or equality of outcome, is it wrong from the Catholic social thought position because it's impractical, meaning it's impossible to obtain, or is it fundamentally immoral inherently?
Well, I think both. I mean, it is deeply impractical. If you really start imagining across the board, let's say in all the professions, I'm going to have equity of outcome. So whether it's black and white, it's male, female, it's gay, it's straight, pick your categories. I'm now going to just look at the breakdown of the society in terms of percentages, and I'm going to make sure in every walk of life that same ratio obtains. I mean, the level of control you're talking about there. But also, it is a deep violation of basic justice. If someone is qualified for a position, but they're refused, because of a racial prejudice. Someone is not given an opportunity because, well, you don't fit the right racial category here or whatever gender category. Yeah, that's a deep violation of justice.
The final principle you find antithetical to justice that Bill Maher agrees with you, or you agree with him, is the stirring up of antagonism between those considered oppressors on the one hand and oppressed on the other. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think it's one of the ugliest features of wokeism, and they borrow it, as they do most of their theory, from critical theory. Mm-hmm. So this view that obtained in the European Academy in the mid-20th century came into our academic setting, colored a great deal by Marx, but also by Nietzsche. And one of the features of it is this sharp demarcation between oppressor and oppressed. There's a kind of binary in the society. Either you're on the oppressive side or the oppressed side. And I now read all of social life in terms of that distinction. That has caused all sorts of mischief. And finding people in this sort of stark either or ends up, producing a deep antagonism within the society. Catholic social teaching is not antagonistic in its social theory, it's cooperative, mm-hmm. right? So that's one of the features as a Catholic I find most objectionable. And I know Bill Maher, I don't know as much as a Catholic, but he finds the same thing objectionable.
So Maher would certainly agree with your characterization of him locating the ideology, I don't call it ideology, of classical liberalism. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the philosophical roots of classical liberalism are and its basic principles?
Yeah, I mean, go back to certain Enlightenment figures. Go back to, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, come up through like a John Stuart Mill. In our country, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton and Franklin. And these are the figures that really gave rise to, let's call it, politically speaking, the classical liberal tradition. Also a scientific side of it, a sort of rationalism. Things I'd point to, first of all, that distinction. We talk about the Enlightenment, so a leaving behind of superstition and the embrace of reason. Politically speaking, human rights, the freedom dignity of the individual, political equality, representative democracy, freedom of speech. I think all those elements that you see reflected in our founding documents, that would be very much part of the liberal tradition, politically speaking. There's like an epistemic and a political side, I think, to liberalism.
Sure.
The epistemic is what we call the Enlightenment. The political is reflected in the great revolutions of the 18th century. And those are still very much alive in our society today. Most people, I would say, as a default position, would say, that represents, the light. That's the good. And we broke from the obscurantism and the oppression of pre-modern society. Mm-hmm. And we want those two things to keep flourishing. You might say that's the ideal of liberalism.
We'll move into some possible critiques of classical liberalism from a Catholic perspective. But before we do, you note very directly that classical liberalism is to be preferred over political progressivism.
Yep.
So abstracting from any particular issue why that may be the case, why do you see it as a superior political philosophy at sort of the anthropological level? You noted the epistemological level as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly preferable to wokeism because it's preferable to critical theory, which was a falling away from these ideals. It was the adaptation, as I say, of a Marxist and more Nietzschean perspective. Those are, if you want, post-liberal figures. They're critical of the liberal arrangement. And I think for all the reasons we just went through, the way they violate human rights, the way they privilege the collective over the individual, the way they question, freedom of speech and so on and so forth, all those things are a devolution from liberalism. So to me, that's obvious. And I think Maher would see it in that perspective too, that it's a falling away from the liberal ideals. As you were suggesting, I'm a critic of liberalism. A lot of my writing, my more academic writing, has been critical of that tradition. But I'll say it in sort of aphoristic form. Thomas Jefferson is infinitely preferable to wokist theorists. But Thomas Jefferson is no Thomas Aquinas. Mm-hmm. So I would prefer Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Jefferson, but I much prefer Thomas Jefferson to critical theory and to wokeism.
Is another way of saying that classical liberalism is closer to the Catholic social thought tradition than, say, critical theory? Or
I think so. Even though and maybe we'll get into this, it represents a certain falling away, too, from the Catholic social tradition. So, I've just recently had dialogues with Patrick Deneen and with David Schindler, and these are people famous for their critiques of liberalism. And I would share a lot of that, too. But I prefer it to wokeism, for sure.
Well, let's get into some of those critiques. So you wrote, and you noted this in the article, this is a book some time ago called The Priority of Christ Toward a Post-Liberal Catholicism that includes some critiques of liberalism. So what are your critiques representing the Catholic social thought tradition, critiques of liberalism, classical liberalism?
Let me try to reduce it maybe to one thing, is the liberal focus on autonomy and on freedom can often take the form of this culture of self-invention that I've been critical of. Mm-hmm. If my freedom is absolute, my freedom comes first, then I can determine my values. There can be a questioning within it of the objectivity of moral value, of political value. So, for example, when Jefferson says we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that word pursuit to me is very interesting because the classical tradition, say Thomas Aquinas, would have been massively interested in what actually makes us happy.
Right.
What is happiness? And there'd be a right way to pursue that. And that politics should be organized along those lines. By Jefferson's time, there's a great skepticism about those claims to know absolute moral value and what happiness is. And so we settle, as it were, for live and let live. You got right to life and to your freedom and to pursue happiness as you see fit. Well, I'm going to see it in a different way, perhaps, and you'll see it in a different way. What's lost in liberalism, and here I agree with the Deneens and Schindlers, is a kind of social cohesion around key moral values. Government becomes, in liberalism, protective rather than directive. Mm-hmm. It's protective of my rights. Or to put it bluntly, it's protecting me against the likes of you. and you against the likes of me, right? It's protective rather than directive. And, if you read Tocqueville and company, you could say, well, that was left to the religions to determine what ultimate meaning is, and government's not involved in that. In a way, one avenue of interpretation is to see wokeism as liberalism run amok.
Right. Yeah.
That, as I say, it's a deviation from or a devolution from. That's one way to read it. It's the liberal instinct now run amok. So that's one way to read the trajectory from, let's say, Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Jefferson to now.
But perhaps one critique is that classical liberalism contains the seeds of its own destruction within it, precisely along those lines, right? Because it relativizes the pursuit of a rational good.
And that's been suggested, and I think there's legitimacy to that. I'm going to give liberalism a little more credit that in its great founders, there was still a vestige of Christianity. Now here I follow someone like Tom Holland, right? The great values of equality and freedom and dignity of the individual. Well, where do those come from ultimately? But from Christianity, from a biblical view, that they were so in the air and they were picked out by the great founders of liberalism. But where'd they come from? They came from the biblical tradition. Someone like, I'll give you two examples. One, Martin Luther King, who I mentioned. The other, John Paul II. Look how both those figures took the language of the liberal political tradition. They took the language of Jefferson and company, but they gave it a moral spin. So King, coming out of the biblical tradition, as was John Paul II, both took liberal language of freedom, rights, dignity of the individual, and they gave it a biblical spin. So it wasn't in their reading so much John Locke as it was St. John. It wasn't just sort of a secular political liberalism. It was a liberalism informed, at least indirectly, by the Bible. So there I'll give the great liberal political figures credit in the measure that they were going at least on the fumes of a Christian culture that was still, operative.
Connected to your critique of classical liberalism generating a culture of, as you call it, of self-invention, with autonomy at the center.
Yeah.
We've seen this play out in practice, but there's also the question of whether it necessarily must be so, that classical liberalism will lead to great moral evils of abortion and euthanasia. Is there a way to conceive of classical liberalism in a way that those evils would not result from that political philosophy?
Not if we follow that path, as you say, toward the culture of self-invention. So if it conduces toward that, then we're probably doomed. That, sure, if that's something you think is right, and who am I to tell you what to do or not to do? If the liberal tradition continues to be informed by a biblical and moral vision, then I think you could salvage it. But I don't know. Many indications today are that indeed it's followed that trajectory toward a relativism and toward a subjectivism. And as I've said before, in many ways, it's the default position of every teenager in America, right? That I can decide my own values. Watch some of these, interesting to me, these debates on campuses when students get up from this, I guess it's Gen Z, and there's no absolute morality. It's just my point of view and your point of view. And then the rejoinder, well, what about, Auschwitz? Was that right or wrong? Well, I think it's wrong. I think for sure it's wrong. Yeah, but what if the Gestapo agent thought it was just fine and it came out of his culture? I mean, well, I don't know. I have to respect other people's opinion. That's the position that they backed themselves into. You couldn't imagine Martin Luther King saying that.
Right.
And stay with King for a second. The letter from the Birmingham City Jail, in which he defends, his social protest. And whom does he rely upon? Yes, indeed, the founders of our country, but behind them, Thomas Aquinas. So he cites the natural law tradition that says there are some laws that are indeed unjust. Well, he's appealing to an objective moral set of principles. That's what allowed King, I think, to be a very powerful advocate coming up out of that liberal tradition. But in the measure that Thomas Aquinas got lost completely, then we have the problem that we're talking about now.
So to conclude, and circling back to Maher here, let's say that he does remain completely unchanged in his real disdain for Christianity, but he does hold these views that are somewhat consonant with the Catholic social thought tradition. Can you give us some advice, evangelically speaking? How do we engage those who we do have this overlap, but also this level of maybe even call it hatred as well? Do we steer into those conversations? Do we steer around them?
Start with the point of contact.
Okay.
Start with the point where there's agreement. And I would say, yes, if you press this issue all the way, let's say with a Bill Maher, say, well, why do you hold to these liberal principles? Why do you think these values really are objective? How do you explain that? So it's not just private opinion, not just cultural consensus, there's something objective here. Right. Slavery is a bad thing, right? Yes. Rape is a bad thing. Yes. Murder is a bad thing. Right. No matter what culture you're from, no matter what the social consensus is, right? Yeah. Okay, where do those come from? Where do those objective values come from? And the same question can be asked epistemically. Are there objective truths, mathematical, scientific, otherwise? It's not just opinion that 2 + 2 = 4. And mind you, wokeism is denying that, right? The really supremely crazy people within the wokeist tradition are saying things like that.
Yeah.
2 + 2 being equal to 4 is a patriarchal imposition of the white supremacy. I mean, that's the level of insanity that we've reached with that. So if you say, no, on the contrary, of course, 2 + 2 being equal to 4 is an objective value or truth. Where does that come from? How do you explain these objective intelligibilities? So I would tend to start there with people in this sort of healthier liberal tradition and say, keep pressing on those values. And you're going to find a groundedness of those values in something like a metaphysics.
Well, Bishop, it's now time for our listener question.
Okay.
Today we have Mark from Atlanta, Georgia, asking about the nature of truth.
Okay.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is Mark from Atlanta, Georgia. I meet once a month with a men's group, and last night the question was posed, what is truth? We had a very robust conversation, and I am curious, what is your answer to that question?
Well, that's a good question. I wonder, was it prompted by Pontius Pilate, who asked that of the Lord, as the truth was standing in front of him? He said, well, what's truth? The classical answer is adequatio rei et intellectus. If you want correspondence, so that's not a great translation, the correspondence between the thing and the intellect. So when your intellect, as it understands, corresponds to what really is, we speak of truth. When there's a lack of correspondence, then we speak of confusion or falsity, right? So I'm standing in that tradition. There's a kind of participation of the mind in the intelligibility of the thing. That's getting closer to adequatio, I think, not just correspondence, but real participation of the mind. When the mind moves into the intelligibility that's out there and claims it not just corresponds, it is shaped according to that intelligibility. When that happens, truth emerges. So I would stand very much in that Thomas Aquinas Aristotelian tradition. It's the adequatio rei et intellectus.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for reaching out to us. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, just visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. We'd love to hear from you. That is all the time we have for today, Bishop. Thank you, as always, for a wonderful conversation.
Discussion. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.